Well, tonight we're going to look, Lord willing, at chapter 16 and 17. And Deuteronomy, remember this is the second telling of the law. So we've already studied this stuff in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. But now that first generation is gone, this is the second generation. Of course, exception, Joshua and Caleb are still around. Moses is still around till the end of this book. And he is basically given his final speech, and then the Lord's going to take one more final battle, actually, and then the Lord's going to take him on home. And so tonight he is revisiting the feast, and then something new, talking about appointing judges and officers, so the civil laws. So we're going to look tonight. It's going to have the Passover, the unleavened bread. Now, just to say, throughout the whole scripture, especially in the New Testament, it will just say one, but it's referring to the other as well. So it'll say they went up to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but they also went to Passover because they're connected. And so you can say these are the three main feasts, but really there's four if you count unleavened bread and Passover separately. Then there's the Feast of Weeks, which is also the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Ingathering, number of names. And then we're going to look at the Feast of Tabernacles. Interesting that the ones that are not mentioned here is the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of First Fruits, or the Day of Atonement, which are major holidays that are not mentioned here a second time. So maybe there was questions on the first ones. For sure, the first ones, the three that are mentioned, if you put unleavened bread and Passover together, you got three. It's because those men that were 20 years old and above had to go to the place appointed, i.e. eventually Jerusalem, to be a part of that. So in chapter 16, verse 1, we start off, observe the month of Abib. Now, we're going to know that more so as the month of Nisan. Okay? So later on, you're going to say, hey, I thought Passover was on Abib. Why is it talking about Nisan? Well, again, you have different calendars that come about, but Nisan is the one we know it best, and that's our March or April. This year, it happens to be April 1st is the Passover. So just a few days away. So observe in the month of Abib, keep the Passover to the Lord your God, for in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. Therefore you shall sacrifice the Passover to the Lord your God from the flocks and the herd in the place where the Lord chooses to put his name. It's interesting that later on we see the Passover, for example, in 2 Chronicles 35 with Josiah, and it mentions goats and bulls as well as other places we find that also. But again, for us in the New Testament, Passover is the most important, isn't it? Because Jesus at that Passover meal, he made it clear that this was the meal that we were to continue to take, at least a portion of that in communion. And of course, in 1 Corinthians 5:7, there where the guy had married his stepmom, he says, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed, Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Now, what does it mean, unleavened? Because on the 14th of the month of Abib, or Nisan, is Passover, but immediately on the 15th starts the 7 days of unleavened bread. And before you can start the day of unleavened bread, you got to get rid of all the leaven out of your house. But since Passover is a Sabbath day as well, it's really before Passover. But the day doesn't start until the day after Passover. You understand what I'm saying? So we are called into our Passover, Jesus Christ, unleavened, which represents sin. And so he tells us here in verse 3, you shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it. That is the bread of affliction. For you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, that you may remember the day to which you came out of the land of Egypt all the days of your life. No leaven shall be among you in all your territory for 7 days, nor shall any of the meat which you sacrifice the first day at twilight remain until morning. So he says, guys, we're going to go back now to Passover in Egypt, which if any of these people alive could remember, they were kids at the time, right? Except for Joshua and Caleb. And he said it was a matter of practicality that we had unleavened bread. Because the bread they made, they didn't have time to sit around and wait for it to leaven. But also, it represents sin, as we'll later see. But here he said, it represents affliction. Now, if you look at the unleavened bread that they have today, you'll see there are stabbings in it, right? Holes in it. And then across it's like a scratching. It's amazing how it does really represent the beatings of Christ. But for them, it represented the affliction of being in slavery in Egypt. And again, when you're done with the Passover meal, what you don't eat, you got to destroy in fire. You can't let it continue. It's done once, and that's it. It's over. You have the Passover, and the meal is completed. And of course, the original one was how God delivered you out of Egypt. So he says, for now on in your history, when you take of the Passover, you are to remember back to the time you were in slavery in Egypt. I want you to remember back the time you were in bondage and how God took you out. The Passover meal was a time to stop and contemplate and remember. What did Jesus say when he was giving at the very end? Now, at the very end of the Passover, I don't want to go into it tonight, just the time wasting, but they had a little piece of bread that they would hide in the house, and they would find it. It's called the afikomen. And they'd take a little piece of bread, and then they would take that second middle piece of the three. So at the beginning of the meal, you have 3 individually wrapped unleavened pieces of bread. For whatever reason, they have no idea why they do it to this day. They take the second piece out from underneath the 2, break it into little pieces, and take one piece and they hide it in the house. And towards the end of the meal, they tell the kids, go find it. So the kids go through all the drawers and they're seeking through the house to find it. And then one of the kids comes back and brings it. And when they bring it back, he opens that piece and everybody gets a little tiny piece of the broken up unleavened bread. And this is the point where Jesus says, this is my body that's been given for you. Take in what? Take and eat in remembrance of me. It's a memorial. So he's saying for us now in the New Testament, yes, we can remember back if we went all the way to Egypt. For us, we're supposed to remember back what it was like before we came to Jesus. Before we have that moment in time where God took us out of bondage of our Egypt, whatever that may be, and brought us into the life of unleavened bread. Now, he goes on to say here, in verse 5 through 8, you may not sacrifice the Passover within any of your gates which the Lord your God gives you. But at the place where the Lord your God chooses to his name to abide, there you shall sacrifice the Passover at twilight, at the going down of the sun, at the time you came out of Egypt. And you shall roast and eat it in the place where the Lord your God chooses. In the morning you shall turn and go to your tents. 6 days you shall eat unleavened bread. So it all depends on how you count it. And on the 7th day there shall be a sacred assembly to the Lord your God. You shall do no work in it. So when you study this out, a lot of people see 8 days of unleavened bread. Because like I said, before the Passover starts, okay, you have the Passover, and then following the Passover, you have 7 days of unleavened bread. But really, you have unleavened bread in your house on the day of Passover, right? So in one sense, you have 8 days of unleavened bread. So you'll see that going, hey, I thought there were 7. And then because it starts in the evening to morning, it could really be 6 days. Okay? And again, it just sort of depends on how you count it, which is interesting, because when you look at Jesus died and 3 days later he rose again, there's all kinds of people that go, how is that possible? If he died on this day and he rose on this day, it doesn't look like there's 3 days. Well, it can be seen that way. It depends on how you calculate it. And so here he's saying this is one of those times where the men, 20 and above, are ordered to go to Jerusalem and there to take of the Passover in the place that you have been called to. Well, skipping on down to verse 9 to 10, you shall count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle in the grain. Then you shall keep the feast of the weeks of the Lord your God with the tribute of the freewill offering from your hand, which you shall give as the Lord your God blesses you. So you'll also discover this time of year is also the barley harvest. And so you're going up to Jerusalem for this holiday time, but you'll also find you had just got through harvesting your barley. And so it's really a time also to bring the first of your first fruits to the Lord as well, to Jerusalem as your tithe, if you would. So you're putting that sickle into the grain. And he says 7 weeks. As we know, Pentecost, 50 days after the Passover. So that's where we get to verse 11 here. You shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, the Levite who is within your gates, the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are among you, at the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide. And you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall be careful to observe these statutes. So as you're doing this and you're going all the way about things, I think I missed a verse 10. Then you shall keep the feast of the Lord your God with tribute of the freewill offering from your hand, which you shall give the Lord your God blesses. Sorry about that. Going to back, I just finished verse 12. Now I'm going back to verse 10. This is the way they teach you in Bible college, to teach verse by verse. But anyway, so he says you're coming up. Now he clarifies. So some people say, well, isn't that the way God is? He only cares about the men. No, you can see right there. It's everybody can partake of it. The sons, the daughters, even servants, the widow, everybody can celebrate together. But he's basically saying the men 20 years old and above have to go. But if that's a burden, I mean, if he said the whole family had to go, it would just be impractical, isn't it? If you've lived on a farm or in the country where you have animals and stuff, you can't leave it one day. The cows have to be milked every day. You skip a day not milking the cows, you're going to have some unhealthy animals very quickly. And then, of course, if you have little babies at home, you got to be taken care of. So the idea is God didn't want to be a burden, but if you want to bring the whole family, bring the whole family. And whatever family is with you, you can celebrate and rejoice. So when we see Jesus at 12 years old, there in Luke 1 going up, he went up as a caravan, not only with his parents, but all his relatives from Nazareth. There was a whole caravan of them going up to Jerusalem to partake. Josephus points out that there was about 260,000 lambs the year Christ was crucified in Jerusalem. And there had to be a minimum of 10 people per lamb. So if you do the math, you're looking at very close to 3 million people inside Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is not very big, okay? South Coast Plaza, Jerusalem's not that big, okay? So imagine 3 million people living, or at least in the corridors. I'd say many of them probably live in a little ways away outside of Jerusalem, but they come into Jerusalem and try to find a place to have their meal together. And so he says, you're going to rejoice. When you're bringing your barley harvest up, and then later at the Pentecost, you're bringing your wheat harvest up, you're going to rejoice. You're not going to go, oh, we got to take this. No. You're taking up a tithe, a 10% of your feast of your first fruits. But remember, you were a slave and had nothing. You were a slave, and they were making you throw your baby boys in the Nile. They were killing you to death, working you hard. So you're now got your own place, your own farms, and praise the Lord, you have a tithe to bring. Praise the Lord, you still got 90% back home. You need to look at this in reference to where the Lord brought you out of. And so don't let this be a burden. Don't think in those terms, but rejoice. So this day of Pentecost, it's also known as the Feast of Ingathering. It has a lot of different names to it, but it's the barley harvest. So you have the wheat harvest, and then 50 days later, or the barley harvest, and 50 days later you have the wheat harvest. And he says when you're there, you're rejoicing. And everybody is having the Spirit. This is what God did it. He didn't do it to burden you. You see, you say, oh man, God's a tough, mafia boss. He's making me give 10%. That's hardcore, man. That guy's difficult. And it's like, no, it's to bring about joy, not grief. He's not trying to get you to honor the Lord of the first year, increase to burden you, but to free you up, to bless you. A person with a greedy taking spirit is a person that goes to a very dark place. A person with a joyful giving spirit is a person that grows in character. And of course, there are some Jews, there are some historic belief that 50 days after the Passover in Egypt is when God gave Moses the Ten Commandments. Most commentators don't believe that. But there are some people that very strongly do believe that. And to be honest with you, this 50 days number, this day of Pentecost, it references to something, but yet we don't have what it references to, unless it is the giving of the law. So to me, it has some pretty good clout that it could be the day that Moses got the law. But it's interesting, because it's in that ballpark when Moses comes down with the Ten Commandments. And of course, what happened at that time when Moses came down with the tabernacle? The people were committing horrible idolatry and a sexual orgy. And remember what ended up happening? 3,000 souls died, right? But on the day of Pentecost, there in Acts chapter 2, when the day of Pentecost had fully come. So we may not know what the exact date or what the point of Pentecost was back in Exodus, but we do know what it prophesied to, the beginning of the church. So the law was given, 3,000 died, but it just so happens when Peter preached in Acts chapter 2, what happened? 3,000 people were saved. When he said, basically, what shall we do with this? And they were pierced to the heart and said, what must we do to be saved? And so it's interesting that the 3,000 souls in Exodus died because they would not submit to God. Remember? He's like, I'm going to ground this gold calf to powder and sprinkle onto the water, and you're going to drink it. And almost everybody said, no, we're not. And Moses said, if you're for the Lord, get on my side. And only the tribe of Levi got with him. And it was them fighting against the other 11 tribes. And 3,000 souls died in rebellion, in pride. I don't care what I did. I don't care if I worshiped a golden calf. I don't care if I had a part of that orgy. I'm not drinking nothing. And they died. But now we see the Jews in the New Testament. They were the opposite of prideful. They were broken and said, what must I do to be? They were pierced to the heart over their sin. pierced to the heart at the gospel of Jesus having to die for their sins, and said, what must I do to be saved? So quite a different, beautiful picture, I think. The next thing we see in verse 13 here is the Feast of Tabernacles. So now we went from the springtime feast. Okay, so you have Passover in the month of Nisan. The 14th is Passover. The 15th starts the 7 days of unleavened bread. Then you got 50 days later. Now we're at the end of May. And at the end of May now, you have the wheat harvest. You had the barley harvest at the beginning of April there. And now you got the wheat harvest at the end of May. And then the next holidays will start in the fall, in September and October. And this is where we come now to the month of Tishri. And on the 15th day of Tishri, which is our September or October, we now have the Feast of Tabernacles. Again, a feast to help them remember. So what were they to do on the Feast of Tabernacles? They were to build these little lean-tos, and they were to sleep in them for a week. Do you think the kids hated that? I think the kids loved it. Getting to camp with Dad. Mom and Dad and all of us were out in this little fort, having to sleep outside in this little fort, this little lean-to we put together. I think it was probably one of the best memories of kids growing up, was that special week. It's interesting, in Israel today, if you live in a condo, the 20th story of a condo in Tel Aviv, you know what all those condos have on their balconies? They all have those little lean-tos. They sure enough do. Do people sleep in them? I doubt it. It's more of like a Christmas tree ornament, I think, than something literally they do. But I'm sure the kids do. So in verse 13, you shall observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days, and when you have gathered for your threshing floor and from your winepress, and you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter, you shall, your male servant and your female servant and your Levite, the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates. 7 days you shall keep a sacred feast to the Lord your God in the place where the Lord chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and all the work of your hands, so that you surely rejoice. So it's interesting that Israel is in the same place on the equator as Southern California. So what we have in our weather, but also our produce. So what do they have in September, October? All the grapes, all the different fruits, all the different nuts, all the different things that you would harvest. The main harvest of the year is at this time of the year. Olives, and they also had wheat. Another crop of wheat was also there as well. You say, well, the Feast of Tabernacles, we talked about this. Jesus tabernacled in the Gospel of John, right? It says, and Jesus came and dwelt among us. In the Greek, in the Gospel of John chapter 1, it's the word tabernacle. He tabernacles. So it's a fulfillment of it. But let me tell you about this Feast of Tabernacles. It's really precious to the Lord. Do you know in Leviticus 23:39, do you know what the Feast of Tabernacle is called? The Feast of God. It's actually our Feast of the Lord, the Tetragrammaton, capital L-O-R-D, Yahweh. Jesus says, this is my feast. And then in Ezekiel 45:25, that was Leviticus 23:39. In Ezekiel 45:25, he just says the feast. He just calls it the feast. Now this is interesting, because when we get to the millennial reign, in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 16 through 19, describing that millennial reign, it talks about how a lot of nations are not obeying Jesus. Isn't that amazing? That it's not individual people are rebelling against Jesus himself while he's ruling and reigning from Jerusalem, but entire nations are disrespecting Jesus. But when it comes to tabernacle, Zechariah says, I don't care. I'll take down every nation that doesn't participate in the Feast of Tabernacles. there in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 16 through 19. The Lord strikes the nations who do not come up, one of the feasts that the men 20 years and older to do. The Lord will strike the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of the Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt, the punishment of all nations that do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So interesting that in the millennial reign is the complete fulfillment of tabernacles with Jesus himself in Jerusalem. Well, verse 16 and 17, we're making good time here. 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses. At the Feast of Unleavened Bread, i.e., including Passover here. At the Feast of Weeks, also known as the Feast of Ingathering, also known as the Feast of Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. 1, 2, 3. These are the 3 ones that the males have to be a part of. So if you think about it, if they go up to Jerusalem for Passover, but yet they got to come back either for the Feast of Weeks, or they stay there for the whole 50 days. It's interesting. They may actually be up there for a couple of months or more, and then go home and then come back in the fall, September, October, to the Feast of the Tabernacles. They shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Each of these feasts in April, May, and then later at the end of May, the Feast of Tabernacles, March, April, and then later at the end of May with Pentecost, and then also in September. All these are times of the different harvests, barley, wheat, and then all the various produce. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessings of the Lord your God, which he has given you. So this is a time of great feasting. This is a time of great joy. This is a time where you're coming to see your family and your friends and say, look at what God has done. We were slaves in Egypt. We had nothing. We were being tormented and tortured, and our male children killed, and there was no future. And now look at us. We're in the land flowing with milk and honey. And look at this giant amount of wheat, all this barley I'm bringing. Or if it's too far to travel, remember we looked at last week, they could exchange it for money and bring it up in money. And so this was a time of rejoicing. And then 18 to 20 here. You shall appoint judges and officers in all your gates. Now, as we go through, you're going to see, oh, they went to the gates. Why did they go to the gates? The gates were built where the rulers of the city would dwell. There's a great city that's been found, and they've rebuilt it back up in Dan area by the great oldest gate in the world that dates back to the time of Abraham. But they have the entrance of the gate, and then there's a ledge. So the gate, it was sort of like a maze, because when the enemy tried to attack, you didn't want just open the gate and there's a city. You had to go through a little bit of a maze to get into the city. And in one little section of that maze was basically a long bench that was a part of the wall. And that's where the wise men of the gates, or the judges or officers, which the Lord your God gives you, and according to your tribes, they shall judge the people with just judgment. Verse 19, you shall not prevent justice. You shall not pervert justice, You shall not show partiality nor take bribes, for the bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. You shall follow what is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord your God is giving you. And so show no partiality. Man, the Bible talks about this in Exodus, Leviticus, Chronicles, Psalms, Proverbs, Malachi. There's so many verses on how you will just unravel a society if the people making the judgments are taking bribes and are showing partiality. Oh, you're my buddy, I'm going to go with you. You're rich, I'm going to go with you. Or you're poor, I'm going to go with you. That you cannot let partiality change the very facts you're looking at. And in verse 21 to 22, you shall not plant for yourself any tree as a wooden image near the altar which you build for yourself to the Lord your God. You shall not set up a sacred pillar which the Lord your God hates. Now, chapter 17 sort of continues. So remember, they didn't have chapters in it back in the day. These were added many, many years later. He goes on to chapter 17 now. You shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God a bull or a sheep which has any blemish or defect, for that is an abomination to the Lord your God. If there is found among you within any of the gates which the Lord your God gives you, a man or a woman who has been wicked in the sight of the Lord your God in transgressing his covenant. So he basically says now there's been found somebody who has been sacrificing or trying to sacrifice something without blemish. And if that comes to the gates, the knowledge of those in charge, this is serious business. This is an abomination to God. You say, oh, what's the big deal? 1 year I gave a sacrifice and, I didn't want to give my really good sheep that I had. I wanted to give one with one eye or whatever. What's the big deal? He goes, this is where man is not always going to sense the gravity of his sinfulness. And so God has given it to him. Interesting, the word transgressing here, the literal word means to pass over or to push to the other side. So it's, you have an iniquity, a sin where it's like in the moment, I had no plan, but all of a sudden I got angry or I got lustful or I got whatever it is in the moment, my emotions took over. Then there's the plotting and the planning to sin. And this is what this one is here. You saw the black line and you crossed over it. You passed over it. And in verse 3, who has gone and served the other gods, worship them, either the sun or the moon or any of the hosts of heaven, which I have not commanded. It is told you and you hear of it, then you shall inquire diligently. And if it is indeed true, certain that such an abomination has been committed in Israel, then you shall bring it to your gates, that the man or the woman who has committed this wicked thing shall be stoned to death, that man or the woman, with stones. So interesting, in the mind of God, there's two different situations that are both an abomination, and both of them deserve the death sentence. One, if somebody is just trying to pass off some defective animal to be sacrificed. And the other is if somebody is worshiping an idol or a false god. Both of them are a death sentence. And we've talked to this going through Hebrews, that there was no sin for transgression, right? There was just a death sentence. There was a sacrifice for unintentional sin, but purposeful sin, death sentence. And so you shall stone them to death, man or woman, with stones. Again, no partiality here. And so this is him teaching them the principles of judicial, civil justice. It's interesting. We hear God's heart on this. In Malachi chapter 1, verse 8, he says, and when you offer the blind as a sacrifice, is it not evil? And when you offer the lame and the sick, is it not evil? Offer it to your governor. Would he be pleased with you? Would he accept you favorably, says the Lord of hosts? And of course, I love this later on with King David, when he is trying to stop the plague from counting the people. And above his house is this place where he is to offer a sacrifice. And he runs up there, and it just so happens that a Jebusite guy, because the city of Jerusalem was the Jebusites, was there, and he was using this big giant stone to thresh out his grain. And David comes up and says, hey, I need to offer an offering now to stop this plague. Of course, ended up killing 70,000 guys. And he goes, hey, it's yours. And David, rather emotionally heated, said, no, I will never offer a burnt offering to the Lord my God, which that would cost me nothing. No. And you say, David is a man after God's own heart. When you're studying the life of David, there's certain moments and you can sense like, whoa, the the Lord is speaking profoundly through something that sort of wasn't a big deal, sort of a side point to the story, but yet it's this eternal truth that we are not to serve the Lord with that which cost us nothing. Jesus said it, right? If you want to follow me, you got to carry the cross. If you want to follow me, you got to lose your life in this world to gain it in life to come. And so, again here, if you do these covenants, you shall die. There's several times in Leviticus 24, he talks about stoning people to death. In Deuteronomy 21, 22, we're going to see some more of this. In Joshua 7, we actually see it rolled out. A guy being stoned to death for his sin. And there it says in Joshua 7 that afterwards you're to burn his body. Well, in verse 6 and 7 of Deuteronomy 17, continuing on here, this is information to the civil government, the civil authorities. Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. The hands of the witness shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hands of the people. So you shall put away the evil from among you. So there's some real teeth in here. First of all, this is a civil law. Okay? So some people say, oh, stoning to death, that's what God wants. No. This is actually the civil authorities. When you had judges, they didn't enact these civil authorities. The judge was a civil authority. Then later when they had the kings, they didn't have these civil leaders. The king was a civil leader. So it's actually a very short time you actually have these civil leaders. And then, of course, when they come back from Babylon, they create a whole new system with the Sanhedrin. That was a very, very corrupt system. But yet, he says, civilly, this is how you have to have a society. And just to let you know, guys, it's a fact. When you do not punish certain things with a punishment that fits the crime, the society will implode. If you do not punish murder, if you do not punish stealing, if you do not punish lying, especially in court under oath, and of course, did I say murder already? There's actually 5 things. I can't remember what they are right this moment, but rape, I believe, is one of them. If you do not punish these things, almost all of them to death, then you will have more of that crime if the punishment doesn't fit the crime. In Numbers 35, 29, 30, remember what he said there? These things shall be a statute of judgment to you throughout your generations in all your dwellings. Whoever kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the testimony of witnesses. But 1 witness is not sufficient testimony against a person for death penalty. But what's interesting in Deuteronomy 17, he says, the first guy who testifies, the first witness, he needs to understand he's not going to walk away from the court and the courts will deal with the death sentence. No, you are there and you're the one who cast the first stone. Well, I'll be a witness. Okay, you realize you're going to be casting the first stone. That's a whole nother, that's got some teeth in it, huh? Did you really see what you said? There's going to be real reality. You say, well, how does this play off in the New Testament? Well, they brought this woman caught in the act of adultery to Jesus. And they said, hey, the law is very clear on this. And indeed it is. The person who commits adultery has to be stoned to death. And did Jesus say, keep the civil law? No, he didn't. In John 8:7, he says, when they continued asking him, he raised up and said to them, he who is without sin among you, let him throw the stone at her first. And they all went away from the oldest to the youngest as he sat there drawing in the dirt. And so a couple of things here is, the civil, just like the dietary laws of the Old Testament we talked about, and I would say also the civil laws of the Old Testament, they may be wise, but they're not equal to every situation. Okay, I do not think we have to take the civil government set up in the Old Testament and bring it into the New Testament. Now, did our forefathers do that of our country? They absolutely did. You can go back and look at the statements of our early forefathers of our country. They did use the civil laws to help them, guide them. They didn't take them exact, but they let them guide them on how they should put together our judicial punishment in our system. And so in verse 8 to 13, if the matter arises which is too hard for you to judge, between degrees of guilt for bloodshed, between one judgment or another, between one punishment or another, matters of controversy within your gates, then you shall rise and go up to the place which the Lord your God chooses, which we know eventually is Jerusalem, right? And you shall come to the priests and the Levites, to the judge, in those days, and inquire of them, and they shall pronounce upon you the sentence of the judgment. So when you're in a village or you're in an area and it's all your family, right? All the tribes broke off in their families. So it wasn't like, hey, this guy murdered somebody or raped somebody, or it's like, he's somebody's cousin there, okay? Probably one of the judges in your cities is probably his uncle or cousin or maybe son, or they're all connected. And so the judgment that they are supposed to get versus the judgment that the judge is willing to give them because of this connection can be different. And so you have a series of judges going, hey, let me tell you, last year, same thing happened, and you got to put that guy to death, and now you're wanting to not do that here because of your connection to this person. You're not seeing it clearly. And so if for some reason the judges at that gate couldn't come to a consensus, they would take it to Jerusalem to another court, and they would agree before they went, whatever they say, that's the final word on the subject. We will come back to our home, and that is what we shall do. And so in verse 10, you shall do according to the sentence which they pronounce upon you in that place which the Lord chooses, and you shall be careful to do according to all that I order you, according to the sentence of the law in which you instructed you, according to the judgment they tell you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or the left from the sentence which is pronounced upon you. Now, verse 12, the man who acts presumptuously, transgress, one who did this sin, will not heed the priest who stands to minister there before the Lord your God, or the judge. That man shall die. So if you got a guy coming up going, I don't even know why I'm here. I don't even know who you guys are. I don't know why they think that you guys can decide my future. And he is not submitted to that authority that's been put together there at Jerusalem. It doesn't matter what he did. That's a death sentence. Because he did not submit to this system of authority, the civil system of authority that God had set up. So you shall put away the evil from Israel. And this is what you find in all the passages on the death sentence. So Israel doesn't get polluted with the evil. Why are you putting the guy to death who worships another god or has an idol in his home? Because it will corrupt the entire nation. If you don't punish that sin will spread, and it'll become not a sin, it'll become common practice and pollute the whole nation. And in verse 13, and all the people shall hear and fear and no longer act presumptuously. So this is the case. If you have a punishment that fits the crime, you'll stop that crime. I mean, not completely. But if you don't have a punishment that fits a crime, you'll have a lot more of that crime. So if a guy says, man, I want to murder that guy that upset me, I'm going to go kill my neighbor. Okay, number one, the court system is so messed up, I'll be out, and it'll be 7 years before I even get to court. And then they got to prove all this, and chances are they'll plead it out, and I'll get 5 years, be out in 2.5 years. So I'm going to roll the dice, because I just want to kill that guy. So worst case scenario, I'll spend a couple of years in prison. If they get through the court system, if they can find me guilty, and I'll probably plead it out way before that and get a slap on the hand. So you're going to have a lot more murders. And the same with rapes. You know, it blows my mind that some girl who got raped could literally 3 years later be walking through the mall and walk by the guy that raped her. He got 18 months. How can that girl ever heal? How can she ever feel safe in society? This is what's going on. Well, changing gears now, verse 14, we're looking at the principles of the future kings. There's so much to learn in this. When you come into the land which the Lord your God has given you and possess it and dwell in it and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren, who you shall set as king over you, and may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. So we see the effects in our own government, our forefathers of our country. One of the reasons we didn't never have a foreigner. If you weren't born in America, you can never be a president. This is it right here. So we see a lot of the civil things. But he says, you're going to ask for a king. But there's not going to be any vote. I'm going to be the one picking who the king is. You're not going to pick the king. I'm going to pick the king. So it's interesting, though, when we go back in Genesis, all the way to Abraham, about 600 years earlier, but around 500 years of history without any kind of king, we see it being prophesied. Abraham, when he was 99, when his name was Abram, before it was changed to Abraham, God said in Genesis 17:6, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and notice, kings shall come from you. In verse 16 of Genesis 17, I will bless her, and I also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall be from her. God prophesied to Jacob in chapter 35, verse 11. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations will proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. Then when Jacob is laying hands on all his kids and praying for them, in that scene at the end of Genesis, on the tribe of Judah, he lays hands on it and he says, scepter shall not depart from Judah, being a king, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. Shiloh is a term for Messiah, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. So I'm not going to go into that tonight. It's a great verse, but it is insinuated that there would be kings coming. But he says, I'm going to set it up. Now, why this is so interesting and so important is because we see the nature of God in action in this. Because this is one of those topics, like we saw slavery, like we saw in divorce, like we saw in polygamy. God regulates these things out of concession. So people point and say, look in the law, it says you can have slaves. Look in the law, it says you can divorce. Look in the law, it says you can have more than one wife. But then later we hear God's heart on the issue, and he never wanted it. And them having a king was something God never wanted. Well, why is he telling them how to be a king then? Because this is what we're learning about the nature of God. God did not want them to have a king. It's not best for them to have a king. They're not going to do well having kings. But at the same time, very pragmatically, he knows they're humans. He knows they're sinful. He knows they're going to push their own will, and he's going to give it to them. Just because you get your own will doesn't mean you're getting God's will. A lot of people, look at how God blessed me. It's like, I don't know. You've been blessed, but I don't know if was God's plan. So this is interesting because we see in 1 Samuel 8, verse 6 through 9, God's real heart on the issue of being a king. When they said, we want a king like all the other nations, this thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people and all they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but what? They have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore heed their voice, however, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them. You can go read that story out of 1 Samuel 8, a horrific, horrible thing happens, and then they come back going, okay, we repent, we don't want a king. And Samuel says, too late. You're going to have a king. But again, they didn't wait for God to choose a king. They went and saw this tall, good-looking, kingly guy, Saul, and said, that's the kind of king we pictured in our mind, like all the other nations. Boy, he'll just stand toe-to-toe with the other kings, being such a tall, good-looking guy. Remember? That was the king that they chose. But next, God would give them a king he chose, King David. Very, very different people altogether. Now, let me give you another issue similar to this. In the law, he says, if you want to have a divorce, then you can have a divorce. We're looking at the civil laws, and we're going to find it says, if you want to divorce your wife, just put it in writing, and you're divorced. And so you say, man, God wants us to be able to have divorces if we want. So they bring this issue up to Jesus. We don't know what God's real heart on this issue of divorce is until Jesus teaches. But in Matthew 19, in verse 3 through 6, the Pharisees came to him, testing him, saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any cause? And what reasons to divorce they were split on. And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he made them at the beginning male and female? And said, for this reason, man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God joined together, let no man separate. Now in verse 7 to 10, he said to them, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? So if you're saying we can't divorce at all, that's God's heart, that two come together, they're one flesh, so it'd be like getting a chainsaw and cutting somebody in half. If that's the way God's looking at it, then why is it in the law that we can divorce? This is understanding the nature of God here. He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, here it is, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. So it's concession. What about slavery? Concession. What about polygamy? Concession. What about having a king? Out of concession. What about divorce? Out of concession. This was not God's perfect will. He just knew he could only bend the branch so far with these people or it'd break. He knew if he said no polygamy, no slaves, then they just say, okay, I'm not going to be a part of Israel. I'm out of here. As soon as you get to the promised land, I'm breaking off from Israel. I don't want to be a part of this nation anymore. It's too stiff. And then he goes on in verse 9 to say, I say to you, whoever divorces a wife for sexual immorality, marries another, commits adultery. Whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. His disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. Which is exactly what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, isn't it? This is a giant commitment, and especially as we get to the last days, it may not be a commitment you want to make it at all. Now, some of you who are divorced, some people listening online or listening to this 10 years from now are going to go, oh no, what do I do? Do I divorce my spouse that I should have married? Or I divorced and I've been married 3 times since then or whatever. You know what? It's going to be judged. On the day you stand before God, you may have lack of reward. I don't know. God's going to judge all that we do in our bodies, good and bad. I'm not saying judge for condemnation, but judge for reward or lack of reward. It's not honorable. But as Chuck Smith said, I'm a pastor. God did not make me a religious Pharisee or Sadducee or a lawyer. I'm not going to say, okay, let's look at the Old Testament law and decide whether you can marry or remarry or divorce or not. It's like you are standing before God and giving an account what you're doing in your body. And there's a lot of gray areas going, is it permitted or not permitted? You know, I mentioned this before of a person, and this is many years ago, but it was a guy who came home and said, hey, I'm going to start dressing up like a woman at home. Or actually, I want to dress up like a woman, go out on Friday nights and dance. And I'm not going to commit adultery. I'm going to be faithful. I just want to, you know, that's who I feel like I'm in. And then eventually, hey, I want to be at home. I want the kids to see me as a woman. And that's where the lady goes, okay, we're not going to do this. And she divorced. They got divorced over it. And several years later, and she was like 25 with 2 kids, she met a guy in the church, and some of the people are going, hey, you can't remarry. You never actually committed adultery. And it's like, well, I know, but he dressed up like a woman and he adulterated them, you know. And she's like, yeah, I have peace in my heart that I can remarry. And it's like, well, you know, we're going to kick you out of the church if you do because you don't have grounds. You know, like a bunch of lawyers, a bunch of religious lawyers. And it's like, no, we're not. You're making the call for your life because you're going to stand before God. And if the Lord's giving you a piece on that, then do it. But, you know, I just come back as for me and my house, for me, I think one certain way. I'm not going to put it on other people. But nevertheless, this is a difficult subject. But when it gets down to it, yes, it's permitted in the Old Testament. Yes, it's permitted in the New Testament. God hates divorce. He doesn't ever want it. It does happen. So I don't want you to have a king. But, okay, now, when you have a king, here's how it's to work. It's like, hold it. You don't want us to have a king, but yet you're going to put all these guardrails for when there is a king. Isn't that what he did with slavery? He built the guardrails around slavery until people wanted to stay as slaves. They didn't want to leave. It was so good. In the same way with polygamy, the wife that was least loved, her kids got everything. How many polygamists do you think were around? Eventually, they quit doing it. Time of Christ, we don't see polygamy at all. So by concessions, he's able to stop these things. Rather than making a law saying, thou shalt not, he gives his heart on the subject. He rolls it out eventually. So if you get a king, when you get a king, it's going to happen because you're humans and you're going to want to be like all the nations. You're going to not be spiritual enough to see that I am your king and to submit to me as your king. You're going to want a visible human king to be like all the other nations. When that happens in verse 16, you shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. So over in the Arab part of the world, they have horses that are the best in the world. You look at them and you just immediately go, whoa, this is the most majestic horse that's ever existed. And so he knew once kings start multiplying, they're going to make their way back over to Egypt at this time, where they would have this whole type of horse that would be very kingly, what the king would want. But of course, then they would want chariots. And it would be then not God being the one giving us victory, but it's us and our pride and our arrogance giving us our own victory by all our horses and chariots. That's why David said in Psalm 20, verse 6 and 7, now I know that the Lord saves his anointed, and he will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. Some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. Then multiplying wives to yourself, So if David only had 8 of them, did he multiply or did he add? I didn't multiply. I just added. I don't know. You can justify anything, can't you? You can justify it. But sure enough, King Saul had 2 wives. David had at least 8 wives. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The man truly went crazy. King Ahab had more than 1 wife. We don't know how many. King Rehoboam had 18 wives and 60 concubines. King Abijah had 14 wives. and King Joash had 2 wives. Solomon, of course, takes the case, doesn't he? He had so many horses, he had to build cities for his horses. He had cities where he just had everybody in the city was on the payroll taking care of his horses. We actually go to one of those cities when we go to Israel, there in Megiddo, looking over the valley of Megiddo. It's one of the horse cities of Solomon. It says in 1 Kings 4:26, Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots, 12,000 horsemen. In 1 Kings 10:28, Solomon had horses imported from Egypt, and from Kiveh, and the king's merchants brought them to that place at the current price. Wives, 1 Kings 11:3, he had 700 wives, princesses, 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. Do you think he had exactly 1,000? Or it's like there's a point going 700-ish, 300-ish, give or take, He married one and the other one died. I can't keep count anymore, but it was somewhere in that ballpark. And then gold and silver. Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom, it tells us in 1 Kings 10:23. In 1 Kings 10:27, and the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones. Have you ever seen a penny on the ground and go, it's not worth me bending over to pick up the penny? Of course, now that they're not being made anymore, it may not be the case in the future. A penny, I haven't seen one of those in 20 years. But that's the way silver was. Could you imagine seeing a silver coin and saying, it's not worth me bending over picking it up? That's how wealthy it was during the time of Solomon. Of course, we know the end of the story, don't we? In his older age, he wanted to please all these pagan wives. So there in downtown Jerusalem and all around Jerusalem, on the Mount of Olives, and there's some of those temples are still there today, he began to make temples to the most pagan of the pagan of gods, right next to the temple of God. Isn't that insane? No different today. What are the 3 areas? Power, pleasure, like women, and money. Those are the 3 areas that will sink any man of leadership. Well, in verse 18 to 20, finishing up here. And it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book from the one before the priest and the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to be careful to observe all the words of the law and their statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment the right hand or the left, that he may prolong his days in the kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. So it sounds like it is saying that his kids would become kings after him if you do well. So you're to have your own personal Bible. So you're going to go to the priest, and the priest, it looks like the original 10 Commandments, or at least the laws that had been written out by the priest. He would have, and he would write them all out by his own hand. They would govern it, because boy, you can't make mistakes on writing this out. They would write it out on this scroll, and he have his own copy that he was to read every single day. Here's an important note. In verse 18 there, the word "a copy of this law." In the Greek Septuagint, many believe this is a mistake the Greek Septuagint makes. We translated "copy of this law," but it's actually the word "copy" is the word "second," or "twice," or "double," or "next." So he shall write himself a second of this law, or a double of this law. So in other words, he shall make it exactly like the other one. But this verse here, Deuteronomy 17:18, is where we get the title of the book. From this phrase. From this Hebrew word out of the Greek Septuagint, we get from the Greek that word, Deuteronomy, from this verse. The second telling, but he was basically to make an exact copy, a second exact copy. So I don't think there would have been a lot of copies around, but the king was to have one. And of course, he would fear God, and he would keep God's ways. I have Psalms 1 here written out. I'm not going to take time to read it, but you can see David took this seriously, wanting to hide it in his heart. And of course, we see kings making some big mistakes by not knowing what's in it. Remember in 1 Chronicles 13 when David tries to move the Ark of the Covenant, and he puts it up on the cart, and he's having a big parade, and Uzzah reaches out to grab the Ark, and he dies. And David parks it over at Obed-Edom's garage, and he gets so mad at God. And after a while, David goes to the scripture, and he's like, nobody is to be looking at this thing, and I put it up on a cart for everybody to gawk at it. Nobody's to be touching it but the priest, and they're to only carry it. So you think David was just kicking himself? Going, I can't believe just one guy died. I can't believe it wasn't 80,000 people that died. But then he went back and read the scriptures, and he learned and did it according to the scripture. And of course, Psalms 119, David talks about how he hid God's word in his heart so he would not sin against the Lord. Well, we want